So welcome everybody, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us for Congressman Adam Schiff's virtual town hall. I'm Cindy Bloom, president of Shadow Hills Property Owners Association, and Bill Slocum, president of Kagel Canyon Civic Association, is our co-host. Bill, want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're looking forward to this, and thank you, Congressman, for taking the time.
Thanks,
okay, Bill. Just a few housekeeping things. Please mute yourself unless called upon. We had everyone submit questions ahead of time, and time permitting, we will have live questions at the end. And if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and hopefully you know how to do that. I believe you go to participants down at the bottom of your screen, and then a list will show up on the right side, and there's a button, is an option to raise your hand. And visually, if you want to see who is speaking full screen, there's a button up at the top right hand that's gallery view. And just if you want to see just the speaker, that will have a box around it. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry that I have to say this, but hopefully we don't have any bombing, and disruptive people will be removed, and this meeting is also being recorded. And before I introduce Congressman Schiff, here's a quick but impressive biography. Congressman Schiff represents California's 28th Congressional District, serves as the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and is on leave from the Appropriations Committee. He is serving his 10th term in the House of Representatives. Schiff has focused on growing the economy, strengthening our communities, helping small businesses, and improving education, safety, and health care for our children. Schiff has also been a Democratic leader in the Congress on bolstering our national security and foreign policy. Schiff is a former assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles, most notably prosecuting the first FBI agent ever to be indicted for espionage. And prior to serving in the House, Schiff completed a 4-year term as state senator for California's 21st State Senate District, chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Juvenile Justice, and the Joint Committee on the Arts. Schiff is a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School. He and his wife, Eve, yes, it's true, Adam and Eve, have 2 children, a daughter, Alexa, which must be fun if you have an Alexa in your house, and son, Elijah. And now, SHPOA and KCCA are proud to present Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman, would you like to make a few opening remarks?
Cindy, thank you very much. And Bill, I appreciate the opportunity to address everyone tonight. And I should start out by telling you that I do have an Alexa device in my house as well. You can apparently change the voice command that device recognizes, but I leave it on Alexa because, as I like to tell my daughter, I like to have at least one Alexa in the house that will do what I ask. In any event, it's a pleasure to join you tonight, even under these extraordinary circumstances. I hope people are staying healthy and well as can be expected. But I thought I'd start out by talking about what we've done in Congress right now so far, what we contemplate for the future, and then we can go into your questions and the discussion. We took up a number of bills in quite rapid succession with very broad bipartisan support, initially to strengthen testing, to provide funds for our hospitals and our clinics, and then very quickly as the economic crisis hit, to provide an enhanced unemployment compensation benefit for people who lost their job, provide a small business program so that small businesses could apply and get help making payroll, paying rent or utilities. We had a large industry fund to try to save vital industries. And yet the work remains. Last Friday, we had session, and in the House, we passed an additional bill called the HEROES Act, which would provide more relief, in particular to states and cities, which are being devastated right now, as I'm sure you're aware, both so that they can continue to provide vital services and don't have to start laying off emergency responders, but also because we don't want to add to the unemployment rolls right now, and states don't have, and cities, the same kind of flexibility that the federal government does in the federal government's ability to borrow during a crisis. That's a major component of the bill we just passed, but it also includes hazard pay for our healthcare workers and others. It extends unemployment compensation as necessary, since it looks like this economic pain is going to be somewhat long-standing. It makes improvements to the small business program that has had a number of problems and kinks in it. It provides an employee retention tax credit to encourage employers to keep people on payroll even if they can't come into work for this period of time. And it invests significant additional resources in testing and tracing. It provides rental assistance and assistance to homeowners. So it does an awful lot. It tries to save the Postal Service, among other things. And I think all of these things are going to be necessary. We have unemployment right now at levels not seen since the Great Depression. And the health of our economy and the health of our people are really intertwined. We can't have one without the other. Even if we reopen, if people feel they're at jeopardy to go to work or to go out to eat, our economy is still going to suffer. So we have to pay attention to the health of our people, even as we try to resurrect the health of our economy. What I've been trying to do is work individually as well, not just legislatively, but help my constituents who are applying for unemployment compensation but running into roadblocks. I did, for example, succeed in getting language in the first CARES Act to allow many of the people who work in the entertainment industry, who work paycheck to paycheck. They're not the wealthy stars, but they're the people that do the catering and do the set design and do the carpentry, who often work from job to job, gig to gig, contract to contract, and who would otherwise be left out of unemployment compensation. So I was able to include a part in the earlier legislation so that they would be covered by unemployment compensation. But we've also made some vital fixes to the small business program, and I've been working with businesses in the district to try to make sure they can access the funds in that program and work their way through some of the bureaucratic difficulties, as well as helping constituents, some who were stranded overseas, get back into the country, and others who are veterans, make sure they can still access healthcare at the VA. And if any of you on the call tonight are in need of our help, our office has remained open. We're not open for walk-ins for reasons you can imagine, but our phone lines are checked routinely. We obviously are available electronically through email. We continue to do constituent service and casework with our district staff. So thanks again for inviting me to join you tonight, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Now, some of these questions you may have already answered, so just bear with us. The process for the questions, we had people mail them in, and then to alleviate any kind of potential question bias, I put them into a bowl and drew them out randomly. So the order that I'm reading these is a random order. And Bill and I will be taking turns reading the questions. Okay, so the first question is, in the coming election, what are your ideas for eluding Trump's predictable moves in the election arena, victimization by the Democrats, demonizing others, such as China, name-calling, bullying, etc., to easily defeat him? We need to be cultivating our political Aikido, Jiu-Jitsu, use his force to defeat him.
Well, it's a good and it's a complicated question because, I think the one who really summed up the administration strategy better than anyone was Steve Bannon. And I can't give you the precise quote, not because I don't remember it, but because it involves an expletive. But what Steve Bannon said is that the other party is not the enemy, the press is the enemy. And the way you succeed against the press is by flooding the zone with excrement, is what he said. And this is a strategy, I believe, that the administration is using to flood the zone with misinformation and just hope that people can't find their way through it. I've always believed, and this is a proposition that is being tested right now, that the antidote to bad information is getting out good information, and that we just need to continue to point out the facts. I think this is really more important than ever right now. And I say that not from just a political point of view, But from a policy and a health point of view right now, there's little more dangerous during a pandemic than widespread bad information. You know, whether it's hydroxychloroquine is the cure, or this is the press coverage of the virus is a hoax, or absentee balloting is plagued with fraud. All of this stuff is false. And it's dangerous to push out that kind of misinformation right now when people are searching for how to protect themselves, how to protect their vote, how to make sure that the health of our economy, their own health, and the health of our democracy get through this trying time. So, you know, all I can say is I think that we have to be disciplined in terms of pushing out good information, continuing to respond quickly when there's bad information out there, to protect the lives of our fellow citizens, but also to make sure that the Steve Bannon strategy of flooding the zone with excrement is not a successful strategy.
Okay. Bill?
Thank you. The second question you've actually addressed a little bit, but if you can go a little bit further into it, what can we do to keep the Postal Service going? Because apparently the other side wants to remove that.
Well, there are a number of issues with the Postal Service. As you might imagine, even before the pandemic, because of the proliferation of alternatives to the Postal Service like email, their volumes have gone down. But those who do rely on the post office rely on it more than ever right now for medicine, for food, for letters from loved ones that they're not able to see right now. So they're playing a vital role, and those letter carriers are out there and they're risking their health to deliver vital packages to us right now. And these are also millions of good paying middle-class jobs. Many of the letter carriers, in fact, are veterans. They have a very rich veterans hiring program in the Postal Service. But the Postal Service is also integral to our democracy because they are the ones that carry absentee ballots back and forth from the county registrar's office to our homes. So they play a vital role in our life. I was a co-sponsor of legislation pre-pandemic to provide about $25 billion to the Postal Service to make sure that it has the needed liquidity well into the future. In the bill we passed on Friday, we likewise, I think, had $23 billion in that measure to make sure that the Postal Service is on solid financial footing up through, I think, 2050. So I think that's enormously important. I'll tell you, you know, the opposition to the Postal Service is driven by three things. First, there's a desire to privatize the Postal Service. But interestingly, those that want to privatize the Postal Service only want to privatize the urban and suburban routes, which are the lucrative ones. The rural routes are not lucrative because the houses are further apart. So they want to leave those in the hands of the Postal Service, which would, of course, destroy the Postal Service and mean that people in rural areas would get very poor service of any kind. But the other motivations of attacking the Postal Service are a desire to punish Amazon, which has a collaborative relationship with the Postal Service. And this is a desire that the president has because Amazon is owned by the owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, that's been harshly critical of the president. But that's a poor reason, I think, to punish people reliant on the Postal Service. Finally, there's the issue of absentee ballots. We saw today the president spoke out against Michigan mailing absentee ballot applications to people in the state, but did not speak out against Georgia, which has done the same thing. One state being a blue state, one state being a red state, suggesting that there could be fraud when you mail them out in a blue state, but not when you mail them out in a red state. I think that's really gibberish, but it's dangerous gibberish because we don't want a repeat of what happened in Wisconsin in the primary where people were forced to choose their health or their vote. People that are immune compromised or are elderly shouldn't lose their franchise because they can't go to a polling station right now. So I think being able to rely on the Postal Service is also important to our democracy.
Okay, that was a really great answer. And okay, for our third question is, college students are burdened by student loans. Would you please propose legislation to make those loan payments deductible over a 10-year period from income earned starting at age 23? Educational expenses after a person has a job are deductible, and I see no reason why the initial educational expenses, including interest on the loan amounts, which allow a person to obtain a better paying job, should not be deductible for educational expenses incurred prior to getting a job. This is also an incentive for obtaining a good paying job after college.
Well, I think those are excellent ideas. And there are others as well, where if young people join, for example, Teach for America or the Conservation Corps or other public service programs, then they would have their student debt forgiven. I think these are all great ways to help young people get out from under this tremendous financial burden that they have. I can appreciate what they're going through. When I graduated from law school, my loans, student loans, were then at 9, 12, and 14% interest. And for the 10 years that followed, my loan payments were higher than my rent. Now, I went into the law where I could earn a good enough living to pay off that debt, but many people don't and can't. And we shouldn't be saddling young people with that kind of financial burden when they're just getting started in their career. So I really like those ideas. You know, I can tell you in the bill that we passed just now, we suspended payments on student loans up through September of next year. And I think there's also a modest provision for loan forgiveness for lower income students, but it's for the lowest income of students. And I think we should be more generous in terms of student debt forgiveness, particularly now when young people can't find work. My daughter went through the same heartbreak that so many recent college graduates have. She just graduated. She had a dream job lined up and she lost her job before she started. So I do think that whether it's the deductibility of student loan interest or the deductibility of the full student loan payments or being able to work in lieu of paying off student debt or greater federal and state support for higher education such that students don't have to incur debt at all. I think these are all things the country ought to move forward with to make sure that young people don't have the same burden that that they have the same opportunity for a higher education and don't have a tremendous burden along with it.
Great, thank you. Following in that same genre, the next question is, what are the plans for a safe return to school?
Well, I think that they're really going to be governed in California by what the health conditions are and what the experts say about whether it's safe to go back to school, whether we need some combination in the fall of online learning or whether it's just still not going to be feasible. There is still a great deal that we're learning about this virus. So we don't know, for example, what the summer months will do to this virus. Will it behave like other coronaviruses and be suppressed by the heat and return in the fall? Or will it be with us persistently between now and the fall? What will the impact be of the reopening of different parts of our economy and that of other states? So it's very hard to predict, but one thing I think we can say with certainty, and that is we should listen to the experts and what they tell us. There was an analysis done, just saw it today in the New York Times, that tens of thousands of lives would have been saved had we started social distancing even a week earlier than we did in this country. And perhaps 40,000 lives might have been saved if we started a week before that in this country. So these decisions obviously have huge impacts in terms of loss of life. And we know now that young people are not immune from this. Young people have gotten sick and died from the coronavirus, and very young kids, in fact, are at Children's Hospital in LA with severe syndromes, Kawasaki syndrome, as a result of this virus. So, we need to listen to the health experts. I think when we get closer to fall, we'll see what the health experts tell us about whether we need to continue with online education, whether there can be any kind of reopening or not. I think the governor has done a very good job of listening to the experts, but also being open to how different parts of the state and the economy can open in different ways and do so in a safe manner. I was on a call with the governor and one with the mayor this week where we talked about what will be necessary to accomplish some of these things. A lot will depend on how quickly we can ramp up the testing capability. We're still not doing anywhere near the testing we need, and the tracing capability, such that when we do identify someone who tests positive, we can trace who they've been in contact with and make sure that we shut things down before there's an outbreak. So I wish I could give you a definitive answer about schooling and how soon people will be able to go back to K-12 or go back to college, but we're just going to have to let the conditions dictate.
Okay, next question is, thank you for your work with the Rim of the Valley. What is its current status? What needs to happen to have it pass?
Well, we had great success with the Rim of the Valley. In February, it passed the House. This has been a long effort for me. I introduced the bill to study this idea when George Bush was president, and he signed that legislation. I worked to get it funded during the Obama administration, got it funded. The Interior Department did the study. They recommended doubling the size of the Santa Monica Mountains Recreation Area, and I introduced the bill to make that so. And it has now passed the House. Senator Feinstein introduced it in the Senate. It has passed the Senate Resources Committee. So it still needs to pass the full Senate. That's the remaining hurdle. And we're in close contact with Senator Feinstein and Senator Harris to try to make that happen. As you can imagine, very few bills are being taken up right now that don't deal with the coronavirus. But we are starting to get back to a more regularized legislative session, in part through remote voting capability by proxy. And so we expect the volume of business to increase. And we're going to certainly look for any opportunity that we can to make that one of the bills, one of the non-coronavirus related bills taken up in the Senate, if at all possible. But this has been a long effort. I'm going to stay at it till we get it done. And we've never been closer than we are today.
Bill?
Great. Next question. What are your ideas for building on the lessons of COVID-19 crisis and giving us a better world that we know all is possible? How can we promote and develop a mutually beneficial way for Congress to work together?
And I don't know if that's your dog, but I've got a 13-year-old German Shepherd. I have to put up a gate now because when she hears me talking and I'm not paying attention to her, she sits at my feet and whines. But in any event, I'm glad you asked the question because what we're seeing during the course of this pandemic is a lot of the disparities and inequalities in our society made much, much worse. And, you know, if you look, for example, at the Latino community, Latinos are losing their jobs at a rate far higher than other communities. African Americans are disproportionately succumbing to the virus. There are states, for example, where the African American population is less than 10%, but the casualties are more than 40% African American. And similarly, if you look at our schools right now, I was talking to someone on the LA school board about how a lot of kids in LA Unified, they don't have tablets, they don't have computers at home, they don't have Wi-Fi at home. So when you move to an online learning environment, what are those kids going to do? Are they going to be further disadvantaged because they don't have access to any learning right now? And so I think we have to pay particular attention to making sure that everyone can get through this and that we don't allow the most vulnerable to slip through the cracks. But I also think that we should think about how we build back better when this is over, how we build back a more equitable, more just society, one in which the middle class isn't so much at risk of falling out of the middle class, and people who are working class have an opportunity for a middle class living and standard of living. And I think that's really vital right now. When you look at other crises, like the Great Depression or World War II, what came out of it was an American society that was better than the one that went into it, that was more just and equitable, with more opportunity for more Americans. And I think we need to think the same way now. How do we build back better from this crisis with more universal health care, with more affordable higher education, with less disparity between the ultra billionaires who cumulatively own as much as 40% of the American people by some estimates. So I think we do need to try to build back better as we emerge from this.
Okay, the next question is a little bit lengthy. In California, renters are getting state and local assistance in the forms of a moratorium on evictions, rent freezes, etc. However, landlords' costs are not being frozen or reduced. This is not fair to place a burden on landlords' backs, and many will just sell their properties, which could result in displacement of tenants and worsening the homeless problem. What is being done at the federal level to help rental property owners and mortgage owners that are not government secured, i.e. not FHA, VA, or HUD, if their tenants do not or cannot pay their rent?
That's a good question. I get that question quite often for exactly the reason that your member asked. And that is for a lot of people, and I don't know if this is the case with the person who asked the question, but for a lot of seniors that own a property, their rental income from that property is their sole income. And so if the renters don't have to make payments right now, then they still have to make their payments to the bank on the mortgage for the property, and it puts them in a real hardship. So one of the things that we did in the bill that we passed on Friday in the House, the HEROES Act, is we provided $100 billion for rental assistance to help renters make those payments so that their, those small landlords also can maintain their income. We also provided, I think it was $75 billion for property owners to avoid foreclosure. So we do have resources in the bill we passed on Friday that should help both in terms of continuing the rental income for those properties, but also protecting those property owners from their own foreclosures. It may be that much more will need to be done. I should say, though, that the bill that we passed on Friday still has a long way to go. There are some significant differences between the parties on really all of these topics: how much we should help renters, how much we should help homeowners, how much we should help cities or states, or whether we should help them at all. So I don't want to suggest that that bill is going to be imminently passed in the Senate. We're going to need both parties to sit down on the table and hammer out any differences so that we can get help to the American people.
Thank you. Next question is, what security measures are being put in place to stop election interference by domestic political parties or foreign governments?
Well, that's a good question. And what I'm particularly concerned about, frankly, is the great wedge issue in the fall, as it is shaping up already, is going to be the pandemic, response to the pandemic. And what we saw in 2016 in terms of foreign interference with the Russians is that they use these cleavages in American society to pit one American against another, or a group of Americans against another group of Americans. And they did so along familiar lines of race and ethnicity and immigration status. And the big fault line right now that foreign powers like Russia, I think, are going to operate and seek to divide us further is over the pandemic. This debate that's going on between opening up or following healthcare advice, or however you want to characterize the debate. So I think we have to fully anticipate the Russians will exploit this issue to divide us. I think we have to anticipate, like in 2016, they'll exploit this issue to help their favorite candidate. In terms of what we can do to protect against it, we can expose it when it takes place. We can call them out. We can inform the American people of what they're doing, so that they're armed with the information to know that a foreign power is trying to manipulate them and divide them. We also need to try to harden our defenses in terms of our election systems, because we have seen the Russians were probing our voter registration databases in the last election. And many of these voting technologies are dated. Some in parts of the country don't have a paper trail, which I think is totally negligent. So we need to make sure that we harden our defenses in terms of the technologies. Honestly, my paramount concern is that we not disenfranchise ourselves, by making it too hard for people to vote when there's a pandemic. And the health experts tell us that COVID is likely to come back, resurge in the fall, and it will be accompanied by the flu season. A bad flu season already stresses our hospitals. A bad flu season along with COVID could really put pressure on our hospitals, but it also means that it will add to the risk of people going out to vote. And so I think we need to make voting easy for people. I think we should allow people to vote very easily by mail. That's old school technology, but it works and it's safe. It's no more conducive to fraud than other forms of voting. At least there's no evidence of that in the past. So these are the things that can be done. You know, I'll mention one other though, because you asked domestic as well as foreign. One concern that I have is a new technology that domestic bad actors can use and are using, but also foreign bad actors can use. And that's a technology called deep fake technology. Deep fake technology is the ability to use artificial intelligence to create highly realistic but utterly fraudulent video or audio. So someone could release a video tomorrow of Donald Trump saying something he never said, or Joe Biden saying something he never said, and you would watch that video and it would be them, and you would hear words come out of their voice, out of their mouth. It would be their voice, but it would be things they never said. You can do this now with computer technology, and nation states and sophisticated domestic actors can do it to a degree where you will not be able to tell that what you're looking at is not real. And those things can go viral. Millions of people can see them before you ever find out that it's a fraud. We've seen some of this already taking place with what's called cheap fake technology, where you know, people can make crude fakes that can still deceive people, that can make people look like they're impaired in some way, drunk or under the influence of drugs. So these are some of the things that I am concerned about, and I've been working with the technology companies as well as trying to get DARPA to do work to help identify when something is out on social media, whether it is a deep fake, so that the public is not misinformed.
Wow. Okay. Is there any true oversight of the stimulus money given to companies? I believe that high-level elected officials, including Congress and the president, were disallowed from receiving funds for any ventures that they may have. Did the Trump organization or any of its affiliates receive money?
You know, the short answer is I don't know if they received money. They're not supposed to, but we have seen the administration do everything it can to neuter oversight to make sure that they're complying with the law. So you may have seen, for example, and there are really a legion of examples now, the president recently fired the Inspector General of the State Department, who was investigating the Secretary of State for misuse of public resources, among other things. The president also fired the Inspector General who was to preside over the pandemic relief committee, the oversight committee, to make sure that the funds were going out in the way they should and for proper purposes, not based on nepotism or cronyism. And so that person has been removed from their position. Now in Congress, we voted to establish in the House a select committee to oversee the expenditure of these funds. So it's my hope that that oversight committee will be able to get answers as to whether either the administration is accessing funds it shouldn't. And I know because of you know, this conflict of interest that the president's sons or son in charge of his business is approaching the General Services Agency, GSA, about relief from rental payments on Trump, I think it was the Trump Hotel property in DC or other properties. And obviously that's a deep conflict of interest when the head of an agency is potentially being approached by the first family to get relief from the federal government. But hopefully these oversight bodies, notwithstanding the administration's efforts to neuter them, will be able to get good answers about how these funds are going out and who's getting access to them. There have been problems with the PPP program, where large businesses that should be ineligible have been getting access to funding. There have been in the agriculture program where, we're seeing crops go to waste, and there's an effort to buy those crops and get them to food banks. That some of the firms that are being contracted to do that work have no experience in food or transportation or logistics. There have been allegations of cronyism with respect to the Kushner task force. We need to make sure that money and supplies and protective gear are going out on the basis of need and not on the basis of political favors or who you know or any of that kind of stuff. So there are oversight bodies dedicated to doing that. They're running into opposition by the administration, but they need to do their jobs and do it diligently.
Thank you. The next question is Congress regularly being tested for coronavirus and otherwise ensuring the health and safety of our elected officials?
The answer is no, at least we're not in the House. The White House, the administration did offer us tests, but we felt that it wasn't appropriate for us to get tests that the American people don't have access to. So when the rest of the public has access to tests, then we'll have access to tests. We are, though, observing social distancing. During one of the votes we had a couple of weeks ago, I voted from the gallery. I've never done that before. The gallery is the second floor overlooking I guess it's the third floor overlooking the House floor. But we were trying to spread each other out so we're not all sitting together on the House floor having come in from the four corners of the country. We're following the advice of the House physician about how often we can meet and how we should meet. When we do vote, we vote in shifts. So I vote in group 6 because my last name is sort of at the end of the alphabet. But no, we don't have testing available to us that's not available to the rest of the public. And I think that's the way it should be. Now, we did take steps to allow proxy voting. We passed a bill to allow us to designate someone to vote for us on a specific bill. And we have to set out in writing how we want them to vote. And this is a measure that we've thought necessary because, some of our members are elderly. Other members have serious health conditions, and it wouldn't be recommended for them to get into a plane right now. When I flew back to LA a few days ago, all the seats in my area were filled, including the middle seats. So I was sitting about 1 foot away from the next passenger. That's not what the airlines is supposed to do. But, if that were somebody with a serious health condition, that would be, certainly not something that you could countenance them doing every couple of weeks. So we are trying to take precautions, not just for the members, but also all of our staff and all of the other personnel who work on the Hill, that we don't infect them. And we've had several of our members now come down with the virus. Knock on wood, all have recovered. But we're trying to follow the advice of the House physician.
Okay, this next question, I think you've answered portions of it, but I'm going to read the whole question anyways. What are the chances California and cities in California can get financial support from the federal government for our expenditures to reduce the human and economic cost of the coronavirus to the country? We have invested in a rainy day fund and a budget surplus so that we can pay the bills in the short term. We should not be penalized for our foresight. We have also invested in housing for veterans and the homeless, children's health, education, and our environment. We should not lose the gains we've made in these areas, especially since we have paid for them and still run a surplus. We are a well-run state that has reduced the damage and the expense of the coronavirus to the whole country. We need and deserve federal support for our expenses.
Well, this question, I have to say, brings me back to my days as a state legislator 20 years ago when I introduced a bill to establish a rainy day fund. Now, I have to tell you, I couldn't get that bill passed at that time, and there was bipartisan opposition to it because groups on both sides of the aisle wanted to spend whatever money came in, and there was little constituency for putting money away in a rainy day fund. I think subsequently, when we went through the recession and we saw just how important it was to have a rainy day fund, the legislature was able to accomplish what I wasn't 20 years ago. But you're right, we were fiscally very prudent in doing that, and we shouldn't be penalized for having done that. And so among the most important things I think we did in the bill we took up on Friday was allocate about $900 billion for all the states and for cities as well, for local government and for school districts to help them get through this, because no state could anticipate the devastation that we're experiencing right now, where we would go within a matter of a couple months from very low unemployment to levels of unemployment in California that have not been seen literally since the Great Depression. And so we have allocated a substantial amount of funding. It goes out by formula. I think California would receive about $73 billion in that funding if we're successful. I have to tell you, it is going to meet opposition, though. You may have seen Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, recently said that maybe we should let the states go bankrupt. I don't think that's an answer at all. And if that were to happen, then the first responders and everyone else are going to face massive layoffs. And I think that's a terrible disservice to the people dependent on those first responders right now, as well as the responders themselves. So we're going to fight to provide that relief. I think ultimately we'll be successful, but we need to do it quickly because the states are having to furlough and lay people off right now. And of course, the cascading impacts on everything from teachers to firefighters to police officers, you name it, will be very severely impacted. I hope help is on the way. It certainly is on the way through the House, and hopefully we can get the Senate to move as well.
Great. The next question is, does Congress understand the principles of regulating monopolies such as Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple, which pay little taxes and have millions of users all over the world?
Thank you. And I think there are a couple components to that question. One is antitrust, and the other is, do they have a fair tax load? And we are examining both those questions in Congress. There have been profound concerns about the concentration of power within a handful of companies. I think that they had certain protections when they were nascent industries because Congress didn't want to stifle innovation, but they're not newcomers anymore. They're among the most established and wealthy companies in the world. And the amount of influence they have now is unprecedented. One of the challenges, and this gets back to an earlier question, is information. Some of these platforms now are the predominant way where Americans get their information. And so the influence is just extraordinary. But that influence is not always used wisely or appropriately. There's a lot of bad information that gets pushed out through social media, sometimes dangerous information. And one of the things that we're looking at, in addition to issues of concentration of power, is whether that industry should continue to have immunity from liability. It is one of the few industries that has an immunity provision, which was again put in place early on in their existence when there was a desire to allow them to innovate. But they have a different standard in terms of the content on their platforms than, say, if you have the same content on a TV program, on a broadcast news program. So the question is, should they have a different standard of care for the community? And that's one that Congress is very much overseeing and deliberating about whether we should change. In terms of taxation, I also think we need to make sure that the tax burden is equitable and progressive. And there are concerns that a lot of very large companies are not paying their fair share, sometimes by overseeing sending their operations overseas, sometimes by use of various tax loopholes. And I think, not just these companies, but any large companies that are really dodging their burden to support the country that has made their success so possible. Congress should make sure that the tax burden is fair and equitable. I will say this, Congress passed, and I voted against this, but Congress passed 2 or 3 years ago a tax cut for many of these large corporations. It was a $2.2 trillion tax cut. And these companies used it not to reward their employees more generously or to reduce the price of their services, but to engage in stock buybacks and increase executive compensation. Well, that 2.2 trillion would have paid for the entire CARES Act, the expenditures, most of the expenditures to date in this crisis. And that's money that really would have been far better spent to meet the needs of the American people right now. So we are looking at both of those issues.
Okay, this next question obviously did not come from me. According to the Wall Street Journal, May 12, 2020, newly released documents show that he, Adam Schiff, knew all along that there was no proof of Russia-Trump collusion. You wasted 3 years and $40 million of taxpayer money. Why should we return you to Congress? I'd like to also clarify, this was not an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was from the editorial board, in other words, an op-ed.
Well, yes, thank you for the question. I discovered 3 years ago, I didn't really have a full appreciation for this, the difference between the reporting in the Wall Street Journal and their editorial page. The reporting in the Wall Street Journal is really phenomenal. They've got some of the best journalists that I've ever interacted with, and their coverage of the Mueller investigation, our own investigation, was very, very good. The editorial page is essentially the view of Rupert Murdoch, who also owns Fox News, and it's essentially like the content of Fox News. According to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, like Fox News, Trump didn't collude with the Russians, Hillary Clinton colluded with the Russians. Now, I think that's nonsense, but that's their line, and they've continued that line for the last 3 years. The reality is, though, and I could go through chapter and verse, not only what we found in our investigation, but what Bob Mueller found. And by the way, that $40 million figure, I think that's the Mueller investigation that you're referring to, not the investigations that the investigation we conducted in Congress which was led at the time by the Republican Devin Nunes. But what we found in our investigation in Congress was that the Russians approached the Trump campaign. They approached the campaign, among other things, in writing, offered them dirt on Hillary Clinton, which is prohibited by law to get that kind of help from a foreign government, which they described in the emails as part of the Russian government effort to help Mr. Trump. And the campaign at the very top level, including the president's son, responded by saying that he would love the help from this Russian delegation. And the president's son set up a secret meeting in the New York Trump Tower, where the president's son and son-in-law and campaign manager Paul Manafort met with this Russian delegation to receive their help, this dirt on Hillary Clinton. Now, they were disappointed that the dirt they ended up getting at the meeting wasn't better dirt. But nonetheless, they took the meeting, they lied about it and said the meeting never happened. And when the meeting was discovered, they lied about what the subject matter of that meeting was. We had ample testimony on this in our committee. And that is evidence of an offer of help by the Russians, the acceptance of help by the campaign, an overt act in furtherance of that by the Trump campaign. This was just one of many incidences of collusion. You also had Paul Manafort, the campaign manager, providing internal campaign polling data to someone linked to Russian intelligence. You had the Russians through a cutout approaching the Trump campaign, a guy named George Papadopoulos, and letting them know that they had the stolen Clinton emails and could release them anonymously to help the campaign. I could go on, but I won't. But all of this is evidence of collusion. And the final point I would make is that Mueller very carefully distinguished, as I did over the last 3 years, between evidence of collusion, which was ample, and whether you could prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt the crime of conspiracy. I said, clearly you have evidence of collusion. Whether you can prove the crime of conspiracy will be Bob Mueller's judgment, and I would accept his judgment, and I do. And he didn't pronounce any judgment on collusion, but he said that he wasn't confident, essentially, that he could prove each of the elements of the crime of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, and I respect that judgment.
Thank you. The next question is, we would like the FAA to return to previous air traffic rounding in and out of Burbank. Has there been progress with that? And we believe that the recent task force just had some findings, recommendations to the FAA.
Yes, I urged about a year ago that we establish and get the FAA to participate in a task force so that communities affected by the airports could weigh in particular about the changes in noise around the Burbank Airport, which appears predominantly the result of a few things, including some litigation by a homeowner association, I think in Beverly Hills, or I don't know if it's in Beverly Hills, but one of the homeowner associations, I think on the west side or in the Hollywood area, brought suit, and that resulted in an agreement to change some of the flight patterns, but also the impact of next gen. There are some other changes to the flight routes that are proposed that have not been implemented yet, but the task force recommended essentially that we go back to the pre-existing routes, and we have urged the FAA to respond to the recommendations within 60 days. So we'll see what the FAA does. I think we're going to have to keep the pressure on. I've also joined in asking the investigative body of the Congress, the GAO, the General Accountability Office, to do an analysis of the noise impacts of next gen, because it seems to be a great dispute between what the public hears and what the FAA says is taking place. And I tell you, I believe what the public is telling me about what they're hearing on the ground. So that study, I think, is underway or getting underway, and we hope to get some good data from the GAO about the noise impacts. I'm also working with some of my colleagues in Congress on legislation to lower the decibel limit that would qualify homes for free soundproofing. And if we can bring down that limit enough, then more of the homes impacted by airport noise will be able to soundproof their homes at no expense to themselves. So, I think the next thing we hope to hear from is the FAA, what their response to these, I think there were 7 recommendations are. We will then probably hear from the GAO, but we'll continue to press to bring about relief from changes in the noise pattern.
Okay. Since much of Kagel Canyon lies in the Angeles Forest, we are always concerned about forest fires. What issues do you see during the pandemic with having adequate fire protection for both the firefighters and residents?
Well, there are enormous impacts to the Forestry Service, to the firefighters, both state and federal. I think one of the reactions that the Forestry Service is having is they're moving away from their current policy of allowing certain burns to continue for ecological reasons, to burn some of the undergrowth out. And they're instead going to adopt a policy of jumping on all of these fires right away, because they just are afraid they don't have the people power right now if a fire gets out of control. And part of it is, and I didn't realize the percentage until recently, in terms of the state firefighting workforce, the state forest firefighting, they're reliant on the corrections, Institute of Corrections, and inmates for about 40% of their force. And because COVID has been devastating prisons in California, those that can participate in the inmates that can participate in the state firefighting is dramatically reduced. And because the state and federal firefighters and local firefighters have these cooperation agreements, when one is undermanned, so are the others. So there's a concern about capacity right now to fight fires. So they are responding by changing their policies and really adopting the policy we used to have of jumping on any fire and trying to put it out right away, rather than working in, I guess, their view more strategically about when to allow burns and when not to allow burns. So that change is taking place. I think they're also making earlier contract provisions for some of the Canadian aircraft that can, the water tankers that can drop large quantities of water. They're, I think, developing new social distancing standards for their base camps. A lot of their base camps in non-pandemic times tend to be great incubators of infection, of just ordinary flu and other illnesses. And so even in good times, those base camps can be an unhealthy place. So they're going to try to spread them out and maybe use twice the square footage for their base camps. The other concern, frankly, is that smoke has an immunosuppressive impact. And so if you have firefighters who are sucking in a lot of smoke and they're exposed to the virus, then they have a weakened immune system in terms of dealing with it. I got my own early exposure to this phenomenon in between college and law school. I was a, what do they call it, occasional U.S. Forestry Service firefighter. So I would be called in for a fire and basically dig fire lines and that kind of thing. I thought it would be a good opportunity to get out and do something good, but also get out in the good old doors, great outdoors, and breathe fresh air. And little did I know, when you're on a fire, you're not breathing fresh air, you're just sucking in smoke. In any event, there is that risk of that comorbidity, I guess, of the immunosuppressive effect of sucking in all that smoke, and also what it might do if you contracted the virus.
Thank you. What is the status of the emoluments clause and the president's violations? If POTUS loses the election, can he be prosecuted for his crimes? And would Biden pardon him?
You know, in terms of the status of the emoluments clause, those issues are in litigation right now. And there was a decision recently by a court of appeals to allow that litigation to go forward. There is, I think, a division among the circuits as to whether you can sue to enforce the emoluments clause. This has really not been an issue that we've had to confront, because most past presidents have divested themselves of their investments or been transparent about what investments they do have. This president has done neither. So it is really an acute issue. The Court of Appeals just ruled that that litigation can go forward. Now, I think that those cases are going to go to the Supreme Court. You know, one thing that was distressing to see in the Court of Appeals opinion, and I think it was an en banc decision, so the whole Court of Appeals, in terms of all of the judges or a large body of them, rather than just the 3-judge panel that you usually have weighed in on this question, is that the judges ruled, the Court of Appeals judges ruled in such a way that was consistent with the party of the president that had appointed them. And, you know, as someone who's an attorney and who has a certain veneration for the law, the idea that we see increasingly that judges are deciding cases and their political affiliation, or the affiliation anyway of the president that appointed them, seems to be a common demarcation, really concerns me, because that's not the way it should be. I think that trend is likely to get worse. Right now, while Mitch McConnell is not taking up the HEROES Act or making amendments to the HEROES Act to deal with the coronavirus, he is taking up judicial confirmations. That seems to be the higher priorities, to confirm a lot of very young, very conservative judges, many of whom have no experience on the bench, and that will merely grow the divide on the bench. And I worry will turn the bench into yet another partisan institution. But in any event, the recent Court of Appeals decision allows the litigation to go forward. In terms of what Joe Biden will do, I think that he has said publicly that he won't pardon the president. But you know, my own view, and this is really separate and distinct from the emoluments clause, is that presidents of either party should not be immune from indictment, not even while they're in office. But I think there are good prudential reasons why a prosecution should not go forward while a president is in office, because of how time-consuming that would be. So you can indict someone and stay the prosecution until they leave office. That, frankly, I think was the approach that Bob Mueller should have used, particularly as it affected the obstruction of justice findings that he made. But I think that should be true whether it's a Democratic or Republican president.
Okay, thank you. And here is our last question. It seems like much of our divisiveness is due to the proliferation of cable news channels dedicated 24/7 to just one political party with no competing views presented. Has there been any thought of resurrecting a new and modified form of the fairness doctrine, formerly applied to just over-the-air broadcasters, that would require all broadcasts and cable news channels to present the competing view?
It's a great question, and I'll tell you, over the last 3 years, because I've had a much higher profile than I had in the past. I feel like I'm a walking focus group, and I can tell what people are watching on TV. I can tell what channel they're watching. Often it's in airports. Now, this is not as much an issue when I travel right now, which I'm not doing much of because people keep their distance happily during the pandemic. But, previously I would have people come up to me at airports or train stations, and literally one person would come up to me and say, "Are you Adam Schiff? I just want to shake your hand. You're my hero." And the next person would come up to me and say, "Well, you're not my hero. You lie all the time. Why do you lie all the time?" And I would say to myself, okay, I know what you're watching and I know what you're watching, and it's not the same thing because obviously I'm the same person. But we do have this stovepiping now where people choose the news they want to hear when they tune into cable news. Or on social media, the algorithms choose it for you. The algorithms on social media, when you look at your Facebook page or your Twitter, and they have your Twitter news feed, they show you the stories that they know you want to see because you like them or dislike them, where you live, your age, your ethnicity, and so you only see what you want to see. And that makes it very hard for Americans to talk to other Americans and to reach common ground. Now, many of you on the call today may have the same experience or remember Walter Cronkite as fondly as I do, but I remember when I was in college rushing back to my dormitory to watch his last broadcast. And that was a time where there was a large body of agreed upon fact, and we could differ on what to do with those facts, but at least we agreed there was something called fact. Now you've got, such divergent views on things. One editorial page making it clear that Trump conspired and colluded with the Russians, another that it was Hillary Clinton that colluded with the Russians. It becomes very difficult for Americans to see the facts at all or see the same facts. And I think honestly, this may be the most intractable problem that we have, because with the First Amendment, there are real limits in terms of anything that can be done. The fairness doctrine, the reason why we could in the past require that on broadcast news, if you aired one point of view, you had to give equal time to the other point of view, was because they were broadcast. It was over public airwaves. And since they were public airwaves, the government could say you need to be fair. But now most people don't get their news over broadcast. They get it over cable or they get it over their phone. And so we don't have the same ability to require fairness. I don't know that a requirement that Fox News be fair would survive constitutional muster, or MSNBC or CNN or any other cable news channel. So I don't know that we can do that. I think that what it's going to require is that we learn how to be more discerning customers of information. We learn how to find and rely upon more trusted sources of information. I think, much like the invention of the printing press was disruptive hundreds of years ago, and it took centuries to get used to it, much as radio was a completely new and disruptive, but a very positive technology, and then television. Social media is being equally disruptive, but we're seeing a lot more negatives with social media than we have with television or radio or the printing press. Because the social media, lies and fear and anger travel literally virally, where truth and love and other more positive virtues do not travel with the same speed. And it's, I think, just going to take our society time to acclimate to this new information world. And I think there is not really an ability for the federal government to say this about content or that about content. I just don't think we can do that. And we're just going to have to learn again how to be better consumers of information and what sources that we can really rely upon.
Wow. So it's a little bit after 8 o'clock. I don't know if we have time for anybody to ask a live question.
Sure, I'm happy to stick around for a couple live questions.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, let's see. If you have a question, please raise your virtual hand. Any question?
Susan? Susan Wong is asking.
Yes, hi.
Yeah.
I have been like increasingly dismayed at the different things that the president can do, like fire the inspector generals or pull out of these international agreements. And most recently, Trump mentioned he would pull out of WHO, of the World Health Organization. And I'm always saying to myself, can he do that? Can he do that? And is there no checks, or is it that the Republicans just are letting him do whatever he wants? I am quite baffled by that.
Well, it's a good question. Some of the things he can't do, or at least he's not supposed to do. But what we're finding is that the things that we thought were norms of office that could not be violated, turns out you can violate if one party is willing to go along with you. And right now, the Republican leadership in Congress is more, I think, devoted to the person of the president than they are what the party stands for. And so when the president fires inspector generals, including ones that are investigating his cabinet secretaries, and does so at the request of the cabinet secretary be investigated, in a normal world, both parties would rise up and the outrage would be so great the president would be forced to reinstate the inspector general. That's not happening. And so we're seeing, I think, a tearing down of the democratic norms that we've relied upon since Watergate. And we're going to have to put in statute many things we thought we didn't need to spell out by law. So, for example, I'm working on what I'm calling our own post-Watergate reforms. And there are things like you can't fire an inspector general except for good cause. You can't, if you do fire an inspector general, then the investigative files that the inspector general was working on will be provided to Congress, so that Congress can be aware of what impropriety was being looked into when the inspector general was fired. Things like this, which we didn't think were necessary. I mean, who would have thought that a president could simply fire people that are investigating him? But apparently, if one party is willing to allow it, then the constraints are only as good as their weakest point. In terms of the WHO, the idea that we would seek to defund the WHO during a global pandemic is a terrible idea. Now, this is not to say that the WHO is a perfect organization. No domestic, let alone international organization, is a perfect organization. And it's true, I think, that the WHO is often too solicitous of its biggest funders, which includes China. It also includes the United States, by the way. But it's difficult, I think, for the Trump administration to quarrel, or it should be, with the WHO for not cracking down harder on China early on, when the administration wasn't willing to. When the president himself was bragging about how transparent China was being, when the president knew that China was not being transparent. When the president himself was saying that this was basically a flu, and the coverage of it was a hoax, and it was going to go away on its own. I mean, if the WHO said half the things that our president has said, then there might be a reason to defund them. But really, the long and the short of it is, this virus is spreading like wildfire around the world. We have the biggest leap in new cases, I think, today that we've had. And we need a global response. And one of the tragic things about today is that global response is usually led by the United States. It's not being led by the United States now. And there are international donor conferences to try to help prevent the virus from devastating the globe. And we're not only not leading, we're not even participating. So I just think, as someone who is keenly aware of and sensitive to our standing in the rest of the world, our national security, our relationship with our allies, the decline of American leadership, I think, is quite devastating.
Okay,
Thank you.
next looks like Bill Ike. is next. Bill, you want to ask your question?
I do. Congressman Schiff, I was wondering whether or not the current PPP plan requires the expenditure within 8 weeks. And some businesses, at least in California, were actually not allowed to open during that period of time. And so therefore they would, even if they qualified, they couldn't meet the requirements of spending the money in an appropriate period of time. I was wondering if that could be, if Congress could extend the period of time for the expenditure of the PPP funds to reflect the, the fact that it takes longer to spend that money sometimes.
Yes, thank you. And the answer is yes. And in fact, it took up in that bill on Friday a provision that would extend that 8-week period for 24 weeks and would allow businesses to pick the 24 weeks they wanted to apply to. We also would repeal another rigid requirement in the original legislation that 75% of the expenditures go to payroll. That works for a lot of businesses. It doesn't work for a lot of other businesses where they have a higher degree of overhead compared to payroll or fixed costs like rent and utilities and other things. So the answer is yes. Both those provisions are in the bill we passed on Friday. Now, I have been suggesting to our leadership that many of the things that are grouped together in the bill we passed on Friday be disaggregated and we take them up separately. And we may, I'm trying to figure out what day of the week it is. I can't remember if we're back in next week, but we may, when we next come in to vote, take up a standalone bill that would extend that 8-week period to 24 weeks. So I think the answer is yes. Well, certainly yes in terms of what we've done already. I think it's very likely to be something that we do on a standalone basis also. And I would hope and imagine that that will have bipartisan support.
Thank you.
Is it possible to ask something? Hello?
Yes, Valerie, you are next. Valerie Wilson.
I guess I'm not.
Valerie Wilson.
Okay, I'll go if she doesn't want to go.
Yeah, I don't know. She has her hand raised, but okay, who is this? Is that it? Azalea. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Adam.
Hi, how are you?
Lovely to
Good to
hello.
see you.
Good to see you too.
I actually had a different question, but I think I'm going to ask something a little bit more pertaining to our local, what's going on, speaking of things spreading, and that's overdevelopment. And I just posted today on Facebook about Tex Restaurant in Echo Park, and they're taking, this great old-fashioned restaurant and the parking lot, and they're going to tear it down and make 170-unit housing for basically for wealthy people. And I just wondered, in your opinion, is there any way to stop this overdevelopment, especially during the pandemic when people already can't afford rents? Is there anything you can do, or anybody can do to stop that?
Well, yes. I mean, that is an issue that the city council deals with in terms of what kind of density of development they will allow and where they will permit new development to take place in terms of parking and congestion, as well as other issues affecting neighborhoods. So I would reach out to the LA City Council on that particular issue or that location. I'm sorry to hear that restaurant's going out of business. I have an annual Women of the Year lunch that I host there. And actually we were going to do the lunch in February, and of course we had to cancel. But yeah, that's a real LA institution.
Well, they're going to keep the restaurant. Sorry, they're going to keep a version of the restaurant on the bottom floor. But it's just going to be it's really ugly. I saw renderings of what it's going to be, and it just doesn't fit in with the Echo Park neighborhood at all.
Yeah.
And it's just a shame,
It's also a very congested area as it is, so it's just going to add to that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I was not far from there just yesterday and couldn't find anywhere to park.
There you go.
Yeah, right. That's it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you for
Thank you.
Thank you for everything you're doing. You know how much we appreciate
Love
you.
Adam. Thank you so much.
Really do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Valerie, are you able to ask your question now? Valerie Wilson?
And Valerie, you may have yours on mute.
No,
If
it's
there's
not
a,
on mute.
Now she's
oh,
on
there you
mute.
are.
Yep, she's muted. How about we do Don and Kathy Delson?
Hi there. Question, the Supreme Court today has delayed release of the Mueller grand jury testimony. Can you give us some insight as to where you think that's going?
Yes, they delayed, but they're having an expedited briefing schedule on the request for cert by the Supreme Court. We were hoping that, frankly, they would just deny it and allow the lower court ruling to go into effect. But they're at least they're going to hear argument on it, but at least they're expediting the argument on it. And in terms of what the court will ultimately do, it's very hard to say. I listened in on the Supreme Court arguments in a different case last week, where the request for the Deutsche Bank records and the major accounting records was heard by the Supreme Court. And most of the justices, their questions were, like we were discussing earlier, very much along sort of party affiliation of the president that appointed them. The one exception was Justice Breyer. And I think that it's hard to tell whether his question was revealing how he was likely to vote or he was playing devil's advocate. But I wouldn't be surprised if the argument on the grand jury materials falls down along similar lines to what we heard in these other cases. Interestingly, over the last couple weeks, we've seen the acting head of the intelligence community, Rick Grinnell, who has really little, if any, relevant intelligence experience. He was a political loyalist of the president, which got him appointed to that position on a temporary basis. But he has been selectively declassifying and releasing information that pertains to the Russia investigation and the Mueller probe. And he's doing so in what the administration claims is the interest of transparency. But they're apparently only willing to be transparent about things they want to be transparent about. Otherwise, they wouldn't be fighting all the way to the Supreme Court to withhold the grand jury material. If they were as convinced as they claim that of their view on collusion, you would think they would have want all the grand jury material to come out and let the public see it. But obviously, they don't want the public to see what these witnesses had to say about the Trump campaign activities vis-a-vis the Russians.
Okay, and this will be the last question. Valerie, you'll be the last question. You have your hand raised, Valerie. No, you just muted yourself.
Valerie, you need to unmute yourself, dear.
Yes, there's a microphone. I've been trying to unmute you from, oh, there you go. Okay, speak. I guess not.
Microphone's not working.
Yeah, oh, that's too bad.
I thought we heard her voice earlier, no?
Nope, it's not working.
Oh, okay, Valerie, we're sorry. Maybe you could submit your question directly via email, or you can text it to me at board@shpoa.us, and I'll forward it to the congressman. Okay, I think I read your lips that said okay.
Sorry, Valerie.
Oh, well, if that's the worst thing that could have happened during this meeting, we're okay. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us, especially Congressman Schiff.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you,
Adam.
Cindy, thank
I'm
you.
gonna unmute everybody so everybody can say goodbye to each other.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you.
Very nice to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Congressman, great
All right.
collaboration.
Thanks, Adam.
Okay.
Everybody.
What's wrong with it?
I'm ending the meeting now. Adjourned at 8:20 p.m.